Well, for the next few months, we're going to be taking a look at the Gospel of Mark and really trying to understand the essentials of Jesus. And Scott's smirking, and Rob is smirking, and Lee is smirking. We've been studying the Gospel of Mark together, along with Pete Swanee on Tuesday mornings for what, 10 months now? Has it been a while? I forget how long it's been. It's been a while, though. I think we started last fall. Yeah, we're still in Mark 12 after 10 months of some study. But anyhow, that said, the Gospel of Mark is so rich and beautiful. And one resource that I wanted to recommend, other than reading the Gospel of Mark yourself, is a book by Tim Keller. It's called King's Cross. King's Cross. And I think it may have a different name now, but King's Cross is just a awesome look at the Gospel of Mark, just super readable, very thoughtful, pastoral, and it's King's Cross, the story of the world and the life of Jesus. So if you're looking for a helpful resource of how to understand Mark, it's got great questions in there. There's also a study guide that goes with this, which I highly recommend, and we may adapt for our community groups, actually. But I'm going to send this around. John, would you be our conduit for that book? So highly recommend as we look at the Gospel of Mark. And I think it's really important to as we think about what does it mean to look afresh at the gospel of Jesus, is to really ask the question, and this is a question that we've all asked, and this is a question that God's people have been asking for a long, long time. Why does it always feel like we're losing? Why does it always feel like we're losing? And you may look at your life and you may go, yeah, I do feel like I'm losing. And you may look even at the church. Why does it feel like we're losing? And if you were to look at the numbers and look at the stats, and we even looked at that video that we saw with some of those statistics, right? There's crazy statistics, right? And so one of the things that's going to precede the coming of Jesus is world evangelization, right? It's the world hearing the gospel, right? You read about this in Matthew 23 and Matthew 24. That there's the gospel must be preached to the ends of the earth, right? Before the end comes. And so if you look at that, man, it really feels like we're losing. Because there's so many people groups in the world that have never heard the gospel or have very little witness that are there. It's crazy, right? And not only that, you can look at our culture and go, man, it really feels like the church is losing, right? I mean, story after story of pastors failing, of churches in turmoil, of people losing hope, of people losing the faith. And we're right now in a moment in time. We're in our shift in our culture right now where people are shedding their previous identification with Christianity. And there's this kind of rise of non-religious affiliation. And the world that we're a part of, we feel this all the time. We feel it at work, right? You feel it at school all the time, right? That nobody's preaching Jesus at school, right? At least not from a podium. And it can feel as though we're always losing, especially for many of you, you look at our culture, especially politically, and you go, man, it really feels like Christianity's in the dock, especially against kind of more liberal thinking, you know? But the truth is, is that the gospel has always been on the outside of the world. Jesus is outside of the world. And yet, He's come into the world and incarnated what life should be like for us. And He is the epitome of all that God commands of us and all God has given the capacity for us to be. And yet, even Jesus, it seemed like, failed. Seemed like it. And it's so important to reset our expectations. The reason why it feels like we're losing is sometimes we are losing. And we got to admit that, we got to own that. But the other reason is our expectations are wrong. Our expectations are wrong. And how many times have you been at a restaurant? You've been at a restaurant and you're looking through that menu and you're like, oh man, that sounds awesome. You read this description. Ooh, wow. Yeah, filet mignon. Oh yeah, totally. I want it cooked medium oh yes, that looks awesome. And then the sides, oh my gosh, what the vegetables with this and the mashed potatoes and then and what comes out is this overcooked piece of meat with a little bit of mashed potatoes and a big, huge pile of raw vegetables, right? Come on, we've been there. We've been at restaurants where we feel like we were duped. You know what I mean? This did not meet expectations. And it will ruin your night, won't it? Like, it'll ruin your night because you're just like, man. And then you got to have that awkward conversation with your waiter or waitress. You have to tell them, listen, this needs to go back. Like, this was not what was ordered. And then you get those people who don't want any confrontation. Like, I'll just eat it. And they're sad. And as they're eating their raw vegetables. Oh, right? And we've been there, right? We've all been there, right? And some of us have been on the other side of giving people wrong expectations, or maybe expectations that have not been met. I've been learning that recently in the photography business, right? Expectations and communication are so important, especially delivery dates for things. I get brides all the time. Hey, when can I expect my pictures? When can I expect my video? And you're hopeful, you're expecting, and you try to have the softest language possible. Maybe, possibly, hopefully. And as soon as you put out any time frame of and you say maybe, possibly, and you throw out mid-September, all of a sudden, that becomes ironclad, and they're going to follow up, and they're going to be like, hey, but it's because you start to learn, wow, setting expectations is so important. And what happens is that when our expectations do not meet reality, this is where disappointment comes in. This is where discouragement is. This is where anger is. Because no matter whatever gets promised to us, we turn that into some form of entitlement. I've been promised, therefore I'm expecting a delivery, right? Happens, right, for kids, Christmas, right? Sometimes that can happen with Christmas. And I promise I'm going to get you blah, 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 right? I'm going to get you a Tonka toy. And guess what? You didn't get a Tonka toy. You got a little, box of animal crackers instead. And you're like, which may be better, right? But it's not the big Tonka truck that you wanted. Okay, right? That happens all the time. And it's so important for us to have the right expectations. Now, coming into the life of Jesus, coming into the first century of Christianity, or was yet to be Christianity, first century Judaism, if you were living in Jerusalem in the first century, you had expectations. And you had lived a life of in general disappointment because you, as part of the Jewish nation, are actually part of a really subjugated rulership under Rome. And you had all these hopes and all these promises given to you about you're a Messiah that's going to be on top of the world, that all the nations are going to flow to you, that there's going to be Israel is going to be the pinnacle of God's presence in the world and blessing in the world. And yet in the first century, that's not the way it was. That's not the way it was. And so Jesus came into a context that we're just going to talk about this morning and help us to set our expectations accordingly. We want to do a gospel reset. We want to do a gospel reset. And our hope and our prayer as we go through the Gospel of Mark is not only that we get familiar with Jesus, because we're woefully sometimes unfamiliar with Jesus. We think we know Jesus, but we really don't. But we also want to reset what our hope and expectations are. And Mark does this amazing job of getting to the core of who Jesus is and was and what he has done for us in a way that the other Gospels just don't. They give you more details. They're going to give you his birth narrative. They're going to give you a resurrection account. They're going to give you a lot of different things. Mark doesn't do that. and they're going to give you, just more of what Jesus had said. And Mark doesn't do that. He really gets more to what Jesus had done. And so as we look at this, we're going to just try to spend some attention on what does it mean to reset our expectations. Now, if you think about, if you're a first century Jew, that was the original audience, or just anybody in the first century, that was the audience of the Gospel of Mark. There were certain promises and expectations that you had that were built upon the Old Testament promises. And one of those promises, and the first we're going to look at, is the Son of Man. The Son of Man. Now, as you may hear that, you go, Son of Man, what is that? A Son of Man. Okay, I'm a man, if you're a male. I'm a man, and I'm a son of another man. Okay, big deal. Doesn't mean anything. But what we're going to look at is the Son of Man actually is a title designated to the Messiah as a promise for the vindication of all of Israel. And so in Daniel 7, we get this landmark promise that actually what I'm going to do is going to ask you to stand and we're going to read together. We're going to stand and read this together. And who's read the book of Daniel in the Bible? Who's read the book of Daniel? Okay, you guys familiar with this? Daniel 7, I hope. Daniel 7, I hope. So in these night visions, this is what we have Daniel say. I saw in the night visions, and behold, the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. Him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. You may be seated. Now, you just read that. What if you're a Jewish person that's hearing this for the first time back in the BC times? So this was written probably in the 500s BC. What would you expect? Go ahead. What would you expect? What does this sound like? Something glorious. Okay. Yeah, Michaela. A knight in shining armor. Great description. Absolutely. A hero. Yes. Rob.
An on-earth ruler, basically.
An on-earth ruler. Yeah. Right. And so what we're doing is we're going back to the line of David, and this is what the line of David's going to look like. It's going to be one who's got all the authority over all of the earth. Someone who has the power and throne of God. And not only that, has influence over all people groups, all nations, right? Classes of people, languages of people, and it's an everlasting dominion. So, like, if you were Jewish and in exile in Babylon, what is this? Not you, but if you were, what does this sound like? That's good news, isn't it? We're going to conquer the world. We're going to get over this. This exile is not the final word. That's what they were hearing, right? And so it's interesting. So just know that God's promise here of a Messiah who's to come, and if you traced all this back, it goes back to the promise of the seed of the woman in the garden. And then it goes to the seed of Abraham, right? He's going to bless the nations through Abraham's seed. That's what God had promised. And then you see that line go forward. And then David, who's actually the king over Israel, has this promise given to him. I'm going to give you a son who's going to have an everlasting dominion. It's unmistakable. This is the hero of the story. And you need a hero when you are going through dark times. You do. You do. I do and you do, right? And what's helpful about this is that the pressure is off for Israel to feel as though they need to get military on Babylon. They know the Lord's got it taken care of. The Messiah's going to come. He's going to take care of all of that. And when he comes, all the wrongs will be righted. You're going to be vindicated. That's good news if you've been humiliated. That's good news if you've been shamed. And that's exactly what's happened. Now, this can very easily get misconstrued out of a context of all of the promises that God has given about this coming king. And so it's very critical for us to put this in context. And who doesn't want to believe that we're on the good side? Who doesn't want to believe that we're the good guys? And who doesn't want to believe that we win in the end, right? Who doesn't want to believe that? We all want to believe that. And we want to believe it so much that we can very easily take this, run all the way to the bank, ripping it out of context and ripping it out of the promises of God as the only thing, rather than it being the ultimate thing. And there's a big difference. This is the end goal. This is where everything's going, but there's a process to get there. And we want to skip over that process. And we can't, right? As Joan is saying right here, we can't. It's impossible to skip the process of how to get here, right? So coming into the world, the expectations of first century Jews was that when the Messiah comes, this is what he's going to offer to us. And at that time, Rome was kind of their overlords, as it were. They had a puppet king over them, and they couldn't practice all of the things they wanted. They didn't have the autonomy they wanted. They had to pay taxes to the Roman Empire, and they were being oppressed by them in many ways. And so they're looking to this promise. It's like, oh, if a Messiah comes, they're going to conquer Rome, right? Isn't that implied here? Right, if you read between the lines, all nations. He's going to conquer all nations. So that means my current situation is going to ultimately change. And if we're honest, we can read this into the promises or the expectations of our own lives. And very quickly think, why aren't things better? This is the promise. This is the reality. Gap. Big gap. And right there, this is where we get disappointed. This is where we can get angry. This is where we can even reject Jesus. And we're going to see, as we go through the gospel, it's exactly what they were expecting. And Jesus it seemed like came from Mars, not from heaven. And so they rejected him like a Martian, not like somebody who's come from heaven. So who wouldn't want to believe this, right? So you get that, right? Wow, we're going to build our hopes around these kinds of promises. This is one promise of many promises and a line of promises. But this is not all that was talked about and expected about Jesus, or we'll say the Messiah. In the next promise that's out there in the Old Testament, that is something that was completely kind of swept aside, was that of a suffering servant. Have you guys read the book of Isaiah, read Isaiah 53? Raise your hand if you've read Isaiah 53, right? One of the hallmarks of our Bible, right? And in the sufferings, there's these series of songs that are in Isaiah's prophecy. And they're called the servant songs. They're like these psalms almost. And what they are, these songs about the Messiah, who is God's servant, who is going to help conquer the world and bring justice. And yet one of these particular servant songs, out of maybe 5 or 6 of them in Isaiah, is kind of overlooked or set aside as being relevant to the situation of the Messiah. And that's the suffering servant of Isaiah 52 and 53. So would you stand with me, and we're going to read these two verses together, or these two sections together here. Isaiah 52. You guys ready here? Okay, and I know Nelson's tall, so make sure you can give room for Katie to read and stuff like that, and Michaela. The suffering servant. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and he was esteemed not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Okay, you may be seated again. Thank you. So in these servant songs, and particularly in this servant song, what kind of a picture do we get of who the Messiah is? If we interpret this as the Messiah. What do we hear, guys? Huh?
You kind of get the feeling he's a loser.
Right? Not a victor, but a loser, right? In some sense.
Patsy.
I mean, Patsy, okay. What else?
Not victorious.
It's the opposite, right? What else?
You can get the sense that the Lord loves us very much because he's letting him bear all the iniquity.
Yes. Amen. Well said, Joan.
It's a thought process of
Yeah.
looking at everything positive.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not going through anything compared to what he went through.
Right.
And this
Right.
doesn't last.
Right. Yeah.
So we lay our treasures up in heaven,
Right.
not here.
And does this sound pleasant?
No.
Does it sound like fun? Does it sound like the future you want? It doesn't, right? Now, what happens when we hear something so awful and so not what we want, and that in comparison to what we just heard about the Son of Man? What do we do with this? And our natural inclination, just like anybody else, is to go, well, that's got to not mean what I think it means. And this is what interpreters of Isaiah did with these passages before the coming of Jesus. You know what they thought? They thought that either that the servant being spoken of was Israel herself, or what this was is the sufferings of the Messiah were projected from Israel's sufferings onto him. But in either case, what they did was, this is not literal, and this would not actually happen to the Messiah. It's proverbial. It's song, it's poetry. It's a metaphor, right? So think about that. This sounds so horrific to experience, and it's so other than what we've heard of with the Son of Man, that it's been disassociated in people's minds. And so as Jesus is encountering people on this earth and talking to them and sharing his message of repentance for the kingdom of God is at hand, and moreover being baptized for the forgiveness of sins, right? As though we can be cleansed through repentance, right? Looking forward to the coming judgment, substitutionary in our place. That was swept aside. It was foreign to their minds. So this is incredible. God painted a picture of the Messiah that included his death and suffering. In such details, such extravagant suffering that's exquisitely explained here, we are quick to dismiss or reinterpret as though it's not relevant to us. And so what comes together in the Gospel of Mark particularly, and in the other Gospels as well, but so pointedly in the Gospel of Mark, is that the Son of Man is the suffering servant. The Son of Man is the suffering servant. Now, just hearing that, and if you're familiar with Christianity and you've been around the block, you've heard that. But sometimes we don't feel that. And part of what's resetting our expectations is to feel this tension and what it's like. And this helps us to understand, what does it mean? Why does it feel like we're losing? Why does it feel like there's defeat all over the place? And it's because we have the wrong expectations. And Jesus is here to help us understand that they need to be inverted. They need to be inverted. And so I'm gonna have you stand again, and we're gonna read another text of scripture. This is Mark 10. This is towards the end of Mark 10. So this is so critical, so important. And as Jesus has been foretelling his death to his disciples and doing all these miracles and being rejected by the religious authorities and the Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priests, there's still an expectation that they have of the Son of Man. And so let's read together in Mark 10 here. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." You may be seated. So, what was, as we think back to James and John and their request, remember, what was James and John's request? What was their request of Jesus? So what does that mean? Help us understand. What does that mean to sit at somebody's right hand or left hand in their glory? Go ahead.
It's honor. They wanted respect for being associated with Jesus.
That's right. That's right. So think of it. What they're saying is, we know you win. We know you win. And we know that you're going to receive glory. You're the Son of Man. They've come to that conclusion. You're the Messiah. Therefore, you're going to rule over all of the nations. And what position did they want? The highest. They wanted glory. They wanted glory. Hey, you win. We want to be next to you when you win. Who doesn't want that? Right? Who doesn't want to sit next to Tom Brady when the Super Bowl rings are handed out? Who doesn't want that? Yes, please. I want it right there. I don't care where Giselle is. I want to sit next to Tom. Right? Tom Brady's a quarterback of the New England Patriots, in case you didn't understand that. Okay. All right. So what's sports? This is football people, okay? This is football people, right? Yes, go ahead. What? You're pointing at your brother. What does that mean? You two are brothers? Okay. I don't. You know about football? Okay. So you know who Tom Brady is then, right? Yeah. So we watched the Super Bowl. You remember the Super Bowl, right? Yeah. So there it is. We all want to be in the place of honor. Who doesn't want to be there, right? And who in first century Judaism wouldn't want that? Especially guys who have left everything behind. They've left their families behind, their businesses behind, and they've actually gone on this journey of following Jesus all around Galilee, listening to him teach, assisting him when he's with crowds. and then being with him in private and praying with them and being commissioned by them. And they're sacrificing all of these things. So guess what they want? I want a reward. I want a reward. I want a seat at the table of glory. What's Jesus' response? Go ahead. To be a servant. If you want glory, if you want greatness, if you're after that, here's what I do. You want to be like your servant? You want to be next to me? Here's how you be next to me. You serve. You love. You put other people above yourselves. And the proof of this, the landmark of this, and what I want you to shape your whole life and perceptions and expectations of glory around are this. The Son of Man. What? The Son of Man? You mean the one I was talking about in Daniel 7? Yeah, Jesus' favorite title for himself. The Son of Man. And it's beautiful because Son of Man could easily be construed as just some other title and not even be thought of with Daniel 7. But Jesus has already been talked about. Peter confessed before this, you are the Messiah. You are the Messiah. So when Jesus says the Son of Man, boom, connection, Daniel 7, right? And he's saying that Son of Man, that one who receives honor and glory, the pathway to that is serving and giving his life as a ransom for many. That's the path. And so guess what? Guess what? My mercy, God's mercy, comes before his judgment. And this is what first century Judaism just missed. They just thought when the Messiah comes, boom, judgment and glory. They didn't think that the judgment would fall on the Messiah himself. So think about this. If they, being Bible people, can misunderstand that, how much more us being Bible people can we misunderstand that? And there's many of you right here that have expectations of glory and honor in your life. I want to be successful at something. I want to be known for something. I want to be fulfilled in this life. And we think it's going to come through our name being great, or us having a lot of money, or us having acclaim, or being safe and secure by ourselves with all of our money, like Scrooge McDuck, right? And that's the pathway, right? And kids, this can hit home because we want more. The service does not look very attractive, doesn't look beautiful, because we're looking at a glory that's disassociated. And this is the beauty of Jesus, is how can he be so glorious and be so humble? And his mission, his ironclad mission, has been from all of eternity to take everything that we deserve. Think about it, right? The Son of Man promise is good news when you're in exile and you're dejected. But when you hear about a suffering servant, this was a rebuke to Israel before they ever went into exile. It was a warning that if you continue on this path of idolatry and ignoring God and building your lives on everything but him, I'm going to shut things down and I'm going to put you into exile. But the hope was that Messiah is going to experience the fullness of the wrath that you deserve. The Son of Man glory is what Jesus deserves. The suffering servant, that's what we deserve. You and I, because of the way we built our lives, and it goes right from the get-go, from the garden on, we've been building all of our expectations on our glory and our hope above God's glory. And been trying to fulfill ourselves with everything but him. And it's not obviously God gets hurt by that, but not in the same way. He's hurt by that because he knows it's going to hurt us. And so, guess what he did? He decided to take the shame and the guilt and the judgment that we all deserve. And here's what Jesus wants us to understand that Mark is so amazing about punctuating. We deserve judgment, yet we get mercy. It changes everything about your life when you think about it that way. Man, how come my computer's not working? How come I fractured my wrist or sprained my wrist? How come my kids aren't further? How come this professor, right? Why am I in this situation? How come I don't have more money? And we want to just wallow in self-pity. Why? I'm the victim, right? This is what happens when we have completely misunderstood or misinterpreted expectations. And it destroys us from within. But when we realize, whoa, everything I'm getting is grace. Everything I'm getting, as Joan perfectly said, is God's love. I'm experiencing His love. And He's changing me through these things. That changes the tenor of every single day in conversation. And it's tough. Oh, is it tough when you're in it? It's tough when you're in the swirl and you're in the storm. It's like being lost in a forest. It's like being lost at sea. And you're just going, you don't know where the answers are coming from, the solutions are going to come from. But that the Lord's just kind of like tapping you, I'm right here. I'm right here. Think about it this way. We want to be at the table of His glory. But yet He came to the table of our suffering. And He's there with us, along with us, and suffered substitutionally on our behalf. And He's going, this isn't as bad as it could be. And not only that, this is going to shape and mold you as a servant. And now you're going to start to understand what true greatness is because you're at the bottom. And I think many of us can think that we are losing, right? Many of us can think that way. And the way sometimes we can think about it is, you guys seen the movie Castaway? Of course, I got to end with a movie illustration, right? Seen the movie Castaway? It's a devastating movie in many ways. Right? Come on, you've seen it? No? Okay, so Castaway is a movie about a guy who works for FedEx, who just got engaged to the love of his life, and now he has to take this business trip through a storm. And he's from Tennessee, and he has to take this flight that's kind of going to the East Coast. And during the flight, there's a big storm that happens, a hurricane, and the plane goes down, and everyone on the plane dies. It was a freight. It wasn't a normal commercial flight. It was freight flight, right? It's FedEx, bunch of packages in there. And pilots die, assistants die, and he survives, and he's stranded on an island, an uncharted island, and he has to find his way to survive. It's pretty crazy, right? And there's this scene, after he's been there for 6 years, people have given up on searching for him, right? It's hard, very hard. But what happens is he decides, and he's thought so many times he's going to kill himself. And he's strung up the noose, and the rope has broke on him. He's come close, but it wasn't. He was such in despair and loneliness. He was so lonely that he found a Wilson volleyball, and that became his friend. And he actually put some of his hand had been bleeding, and he got a palm mark on it with blood, but he called it Wilson, and that became his friend, and he talked to him. But anyhow, that's all setting up his desire to go, you know what, I got to do something about this. So he built himself a raft, and he took all the tools and materials that he had, and he's trying to muster up. This is his last stand. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna put myself in a position of rescue. And so he gets out there, and things are just falling apart on him. And after a couple of weeks, he's just sitting there. He's got no water, big old beard, sun's beating down on him. He's just there. And there's this scene, it's this perfectly cut scene where he's just there on the raft. And then you hear this whale just go, like a big humpback whale. And he gets sprayed, and he's like, And he's like sleeping, and he's like sunburnt, and he's just sitting there like, And then you see behind him, it's this big, huge barge coming by. Big, huge, huge barge with all of these trailers on it. And here it is. He's finally gotten rescued. He got no voice. He can't even lift his arm. They see him there, right? And most of us think that the church is like Tom Hanks in Castaway. And the world is this big barge going by. And we have done everything we can, and we're floundering, and we're just blah. And then rescue comes from glitz, glamour, security, perfection, glory in this big, huge barge, right? That's industry, we're being saved by it somehow, right? And we feel like we're losing. We can often feel like we're losing. But the truth is, and this is what Jesus is resolute in us understanding, is that the world is on the raft. The world is on the raft. We're in the barge. We're safe, secure, and rescued. And you need to feel that. You need to know that. You're rescued if you're in Jesus. And you don't lose. We haven't lost. We have won because he did lose in our place. And that redefines everything for you. So when you go to work, it's not this like, I guess I'm not performing. I guess things aren't going well. I guess, And it's like, no, you're victorious. You have won. And Jesus has given you everything that you need. And this is just icing on the cake. And he's saying, hey, now that you've won, you can serve other people and help them to get on board. You're on the barge. You're on the barge. You have won. And the world is working together to scrap all of its resources together as best as it can and muster a final stand. And it's going to sink. And Jesus is the rescue. He is the rescue. But he had to come and put himself on the island. And he had to go through that suffering in order to rescue us so we could be on that barge. And this is the Gospel of Mark. And we're going to continue to look at this and set our expectations accordingly. And so that's our big idea. That's our big idea. The gospel resets our expectations and our hope. And it hits every aspect of life. We're going to talk about those aspects throughout our series in Mark. And so just I'll ask you this. What are you expecting? What are you expecting? And are your expectations in keeping with the gospel? Are your expectations in keeping with the gospel? And we'll continue to ask that question as we look at Mark's gospel. So let's pray and ask the Lord's help.